We're very lucky today to have two of my favourite raconteurs and two respected eminence grise from the worlds of property and regeneration, Peter Bilt and Jackie Sadek. Peter, most of you will know him as the former editor of EG, but he has had many more strings to his bows in his life. Jackie, I don't know what you'll know her as, but recently she's been working, she's had 10 years in Nottingham and Biggleswade. You get less for aggravated assault. Anyway, I'm going to hand on now to Peter to start talking to us about what he thinks about how the government could really solve this housing crisis. So, Peter, kick us off.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Ross. I think that the reason we're together, Jackie and I, is that we will be mercilessly plugging a book we've just written, which is due out next week. And most of what I tell you, or what I assert, will come from that. And I think that the first thing to say is that the government's plans to solve the housing crisis are based on a fairy tale. There is no such thing about the planning system being able to produce more homes. Home production comes from house builders, pretty much in the main. They control the supply valve. They twist the wheel, open or shut, with an eye to the economy, not to what Boris tells them. It's complete sophistry to say that changing the planning system will magic up homes. That's one of the key findings in the book itself. You will have also heard over the last, 6-9 months or so, the word beauty coming into housing. It's being used mainly because most people are ashamed of what's gone up already, and they would like something to look a little nicer. And they think if they can make things look a bit nicer, well, they won't have so much trouble at the planning stage. I think what we have found really is that the occupants of houses aren't regarded by anyone in the industry as human beings living 21st century lives. They live essentially in the eyes of the profession as ghosts in the machine. They're forced to sort of fit the mold rather than form it. And what you discover, of course, is that they're squeezed into homes no bigger than those of the 19th century, back to backs. If you haven't got any money, you get the space squeezed. And I think, as one of Jackie's mentors says, everybody deserves a bit better than that. Back in the May era, which is not that long ago, they very nearly got to the point of doing something about this. And Mrs. May talked about wanting to see an end to the era of too small homes that kept housing numbers ticking over, but are barely fit for modern family life, is what she said in pretty much her last speech. Boris Johnson, when he was Mayor of London, to be fair to him, introduced space standards and made them bigger than the Parker Morris space standards by 10%. One of the things that we would like to see is that those space standards should be made universal, and they should be made mandatory, and they should be higher than plus 10%, perhaps plus 25% on Parker Morris at a minimum. Now, to do this, there is a reason for asking for this, and that is that we feel that if you're competing for land, and the house builders don't quite agree with this, but I still stick with this. If you're competing for land, you have to put in as many square feet of sellable space as you can. Otherwise, the next guy will just put more in. And you get this great squeeze on density, which we've had over the last, since about mid-90s. You'd be horrified at how we've gone from, I think it was probably 20, 25 homes to the hectare, up to 40, 45 now. Just quietly, this quiet, great big squeeze over that period. And unless you have this floor on space standards set by the government, nothing will change, and that squeeze will stay where it is. And you end up with houses like we've got in the book that are 12 foot wide, over 3 floors, 670 square feet, and the ground with the ground floor of about 220 square feet. That's not much bigger than most people's living rooms. And I think, just to end my little bit before I hand over to Jackie, if this coronavirus thing has taught us anything, it's taught us the need to have decent homes to now live and work in. Not for everybody, but for a lot of people who like to have to work at home now. And it's all very well for me sitting here with my posh books behind me and a conservatory sitting in front of me. But a lot of people don't have that, and they'd be squashed up in houses that are far too small for them in families. Well, that's the opening. Peroration from me. Jackie has other parts of the book which she's written about her journey through the planning system, and also she has, in the final chapter, got a magic wand which she puts in a series of wishes. Now, which of these she wants to talk about, who knows? But I will hand over to Jackie now to carry on the conversation.
Well, he hands over to me, and can I say thank you for having us this afternoon. It's a joy to talk to you, and we're great fans of Real Estate Live. I have to say immediately that Peter Bill has curated that bookshelf quite carefully. These aren't his normal reading choices. And as for Ross Sterling, you must never trust a moderator who starts the whole conversation by saying, trust me, the next hour is going to be fantastic. In fact, never trust a man, whoever says, trust me, the next hour is going to be fantastic. That's a big mistake, big mistake. Yeah, I mean, you're going to get a bit of a howl of outrage out of the two of us in the next few minutes for the rest of the hour, really, because we are pretty cross about this stuff. Actually, we look laid back now. That's because we've been forced into our homes for the last 8 months, but we are really very angry about the state of housing in this country, and I think with some justification. I think it's the sane position to take. As Ross says, I've now spent 10 years, God help me, setting up UK Regeneration. We spent many years on projects that didn't work, and we're now on one that does work. In the middle of all of that, I kind of up sticks and buggered off to work for the government for 3 years as a regeneration advisor, which, you know, if somebody asks you to come in and tell the government what to do in your chosen field, you can't say no if you're not terribly happy with the particular administration concerned. But, you know, I had to say yes. And I went into government. I have to tell you, I found it the most brilliant 3 years, really. And I loved the job. I loved running around Whitehall. I loved running around the country telling people what to do. It couldn't have been any better. But I became more and more frustrated and more exasperated with how much easier it was to go around telling people what to do than it was to actually do it. And that actually nobody out there was doing it. And I got more and more cross with the fact that there wasn't any real clean, green, inclusive growth, as I would have called it, going on, and that people weren't accepting the challenge. And I thought, well, I've got to go back out really and walk the walk. So we acquired a site in early 2016, and I resigned my job from government with great regret. And the site is in the middle of Bedfordshire. As Ross says, it's in a place called Biggleswade, a rather charming Harry Potter-esque type name. And it's a very charming market town, actually, which I've come to love very dearly. But it's a classic situation of a tired market town that needs regeneration. And it needs regeneration through doing some growth alongside in a clean, green, inclusive, planned way. So we set around planning our what started off life actually as an urban extension. I then realised was in fact a rural extension, and then I realised that actually it was a village on the side of an existing market town. You have to be careful about the terminology here. But anyway, long and short of it is I got a consent for 1,500 homes within the 3 years, within 3 years of buying the site. So, you know, the industry thinks I've moved at mercurial speed, I might tell you. My business partner thinks this has been glacial, but let's not talk about that too much. But in the middle of all of this, we got to the kind of realization in UKR that people the people, the very entities that we were building for were almost entirely absent from the model. As Peter says, the ghosts in the machine, they'd almost been entirely forgotten about. In the office industry, you still have, even now, I think, post-occupancy evaluation. You know, people go in and test whether offices work. Nobody ever talks to people about whether their homes work after they've sold them the home and they've legged off into the sunset with the profits. It's a completely one transaction model, and there is no repeat business, because you know, you then go into the mainstream market and you won't be buying from that particular developer again. So no real brand loyalty, none of the stuff that goes with ordinary industry patterns, it gets developed. It's all, you know, wham bam, thank you ma'am, off into the sunset with my bag full of swag. And too bad if you've got snagging problems. And I think, you know, famously there was a house, I'm not going to mention who the developer was, but there was a house bought by somebody who was so disgruntled, they listed the snagging problems down the side of their end of terrace house. So I think you'll find it in Cornwall, if any of you are interested in Googling. I'm not going to say who it was, but you won't be surprised when you learn. You know, this is not a great way of building homes. We still have a housing crisis, and the only product really that's on offer, and we are talking about 60% of the stock being built out by 8 companies. I mean, this is one hell of a statistic of a stranglehold on the market of the sorts of homes that Peter is talking about. You know, you couldn't swing a cat. And, you know, so we kind of developed a model. We wanted to swing a tiger. This was the thing. We wanted to not swing a cat, swing a tiger. We wanted to develop homes for people. And we alighted on a thing whereby we would try and develop homes that were 25% above space standards. Now, we fell at the first hurdle on that. We haven't let go of it as an aspiration, but we fell at the first hurdle because the planners didn't understand the model. They couldn't get it. And they kept saying, well, why don't you just do more, squeeze more in? The housing associations couldn't make it work for the housing association model. You know, they didn't want 25% homes 25% above. It was a real struggle, but we hung on to the mission, which was, we thought we could build homes at scale, at quality, to a pace. We thought we could do it in a place where people wanted to live. We thought we could do it commercially. We thought we could do it without compromising the natural environment and without legging over the community. That was what we set out to do. And that mission remains central, and that we have adhered to. We are still struggling on the space standards at reserve matters stage, and we'll probably come back to that during the course of today's discussion. But it was putting people at the heart of the model, which was the radical departure that we made from UKR, from the normal, and why we see ourselves as unashamed market disruptors. And then one day I was having lunch with Mr. Peter Bill in the Reform Club, as one does. If you are lunching with Mr. Peter Bill, you go to one's club. And we went to one's club and we had a very lovely lunch and a lovely glass of Chablis, as you do. And I was wringing my hands about the housing crisis, and Peter was wringing his hands about the industry. And I was saying I wanted to capture all of this. And in that very epic lunch, we cooked up this plan to write a book. And so we wrote this book, and it took us about a year. And it's a kind of massive kind of howl of outrage and a polemic, which comes mainly from me with my kind of, you know, indignation, you know, incandescent with rage. And then a huge amount of proper analysis, which of course comes from Peter, because he is bloody brainy and because he holds the institutional memory really of the property industry and knows everybody and knows everything. And so what you've got is a kind of weird blend of the two of us kind of conflated together in this kind of bonkers book, which is coming out next week, which is part a story of UKR and the journey and why things have to be done differently, and part an analysis and real proper hard-nosed numerical analysis to how we've got into this mess. And the housing crisis has been, what, 2 decades more in the making? And it's going to take us 2 decades to come out of it, in our view. We don't think there's any magic bullets. Before he starts on about my magic wand and all the rest of it, there are no magic bullets. We've got some ideas, but I have to say what you've got in there is a howl of outrage. And it goes back time and time again to the UKR motto, which, as Peter says, is everyone deserves better.
Thank you, Jackie. Can I butt in again now, just to go into some of the details? Jackie's right. My stuff is sort of outraged by numbers, and hers is outraged by words, really. I think I've probably been a bit fairer to the house builders than Jackie would have liked me to have been. We've had some very good help from one or two, most notably Barrett's, in giving us advice and guidance where I've got it completely wrong. They have put me right. They have provided a lot of stuff for us on how long it does take to build houses. And so all credit to them, mainly for the thing we did to try and bring these ghosts into the machine. The first two chapters of the book essentially are based upon an appraisal model. The appraisal model is one piece of land. Nice builder, brackets Jackie, wants to put 1,500 homes on it. Not so nice builder, somebody else wants to put 2,000 homes on it. And I've got the model. The model has been done, and yes, it does affect the residual land value to put on 1,500 houses. The residual land value on 2,000 houses popped out at 24 million. The residual land value on 1,500 houses popped out at 16 million. So there is an attempt to try and show what happens when you build better for everyone. And it does affect it a little bit. Although I would point you to the other help meet we had in the book, which is Knight Frank. Unbeknown to us, they were doing a big exercise for the government to back up this beauty stuff you keep hearing about. And their report it's on the government website. It is extremely interesting to read. There's 80 or 90 pages of it. Some of it actually involves looking at an imaginary site, believe it or not. So they had much the same idea as we did. Now, what they came up with was that if you do it better, you can charge more. And if you charge more, you get back the costs that you put into it. And so one thing can balance out the other. So the bottom line from the Knight Frank stuff is that if you do it well, you will recover your money and the land value doesn't move very much. I mean, there's one bit in it that shows what the house builders on this particular site thought was going to happen to the land value if they made the houses posh. They thought the land value would drop from 483,000 an acre to 97,000 pounds an acre. The outturn was the land value hardly dropped at all. The outturn, what was left from when you did the outturn. So I think we tried to just not be, in the clouds about it and tried to show that actually it can be done better if you have baseline space standards and density standards. So that's that from me. I think, what else would I say?
Let me ask you a question, Peter.
Yes, go on.
You're asking, your book asks for house builders to build bigger homes at lower densities. And those of us who watch the industry might just say, well, that's not going to happen. I mean, what's the...
I think there's probably a 97.34% chance of you being right, actually, Ross, over the next 10 years. But I think somebody's got to say this. And my view is that, and I've spoken to house builders about this, and they sort of and ah and slightly agree and then don't really agree and wish I'd go away. If there was a floor on the number of homes you could put on a site, and if there was a ceiling on the number of homes you could put on a site and a floor on the size that those homes could be, that would impact what they would pay for the land. Because as the guy from Barrett's told me, they put these numbers in before they buy the land, long before they buy the land. And and this is where they shy away from you when you ask this question. You say to them, well, if there was a ceiling on the density and a floor on the land value, wouldn't that make it easier for you? Because it means that everybody be playing off the same base. But they don't like that argument at all, and will continue to resist it, I'm fairly sure. So, I think we got to try. And I think one of the things that I could hope that would happen is that at least somebody give it a go, maybe on one of the new towns where the land values are low enough for this to happen. Who have you seen the new towns program? It's pathetic. There's 400,000 new homes in 50 new towns. Hardly any are built, haven't been built for 20 years. About 14,000 expected to be built by 2024. It's a disaster because nobody wants to live in a new town. Go and see everybody.
I think the point, before he starts ranting about new towns, I think the point I think we had to make was we had to point out the problems here. And Peter's absolutely right. And you're absolutely right in the premise of your question. I mean, the chances of this actually taking within the mainstream industry, I think, is remote. But if you know, and I know, that anybody who knows anything about buying a home probably wouldn't buy a new home, actually, would probably buy an old home. Anybody who knows anything about buying a flat in London knows that the very best flats to buy in London are old council housing flats, old council block flats, because of course they were built to Parker Morris standards. So, you get over yourself about your anxiety about buying a council flat because you're going to have more space and you're going to be able to bring up a family in them. So, we needed to point this out. The other thing that Peter's absolutely right about, and you'll get from this, Ross, that he and I bickered most pleasurably right the way through the process of writing this book, which took a lot of lunches in the Reform Club, I might tell you. We bickered about all of this all the time. And what he demonstrated to me very, very ably was that not all volume house builders are the same, actually, and that some of them actually are doing very, very good stuff. And we pick out Barratt's because at the end of the day, we think Barratt's are actually doing their level best to build for people and have actually been incredibly helpful and are very conscious of the fact that they need to change. They're very conscious about it and very kind of egalitarian in their thinking. So we know that not all house builders are the same. We also know that if you've got a housing crisis, then you don't beat up the only people who are actually providing any homes at all. You have to live and let live. And I think this is the Homes England anxiety the whole time, is they can't be mean to the volume house builders because otherwise they haven't got anybody at all. So we are where we are, and we have to. Now we in UKR intend to demonstrate that bigger homes are more long-term value, but we haven't yet demonstrated that. Peter and I had our last lunch in the Reform Club on the 19th of March this year, and we were just putting the book to bed. That night, I was supposed to be going out for dinner with Tony Pidgley, and I emailed him to give him the option of not turning up to. We were going to be in the Goring, which was one of his favourite haunts, because of course we were just going into lockdown, and we cancelled our dinner and said we'd have it later. Of course, that's never happened now, and it's a very poignant memory for me. But as we were going into lockdown, the very last interview we did was with Toby Lloyd, former government advisor to Mrs. May, who was really luminous, I have to tell you, in all of this, really brilliant mind on this issue. It was very poignant for us. The very last lunch we had together, the last time we saw one another, we were sitting there thinking, well, what sort of timing, what on earth have we done? We've gone and written a book about the housing crisis, which is a long-term problem. We're about to go into a huge pandemic. Is our timing brilliant or is it hopeless? Well, of course, it transpired, what with all the lifestyle magazine stuff and all the stuff you've seen about people having to use their homes as their workplaces. You don't work from home, you live at work, all this sort of stuff that we see written up in all the Sundays all the time. One's home has become incredibly important. And the whole idea of the other stuff that UKR was trying to push, which was this 15-minute community. You can get everything you need to run your life within 15 minutes of your walking distance of your home. All of that stuff has come to the fore. And actually, our stuff on space standards, you're right. We're not going to persuade the volume house builders overnight that this is the way forward. But we do think there is room for massive reform, and that's got to start somewhere. We wanted to start this fire somewhere.
So,
yeah.
I mean, there's one sector. You know, your premise that volume house builders don't really talk to their customers. I think I probably agree with you. I mean, they sell them one house typically in their lifetime. Why would you build a lasting relationship with a customer like that?
I think they do.
What about the build to rent sector? Do you think that's
well? First of all,
can
I say that they do talk to their customers. But they talk to them as customers. Okay. And they talk to them a lot, and the better ones talk to them a great deal, and they'll be bridling at the thought that they don't talk to them, but they only talk to them to discover what it is they can sell them best and how much they can afford to pay for it. Yeah, what they don't do and what nobody does, and this applies to architects, it applies to developers, and it applies to agents. Nobody has the slightest interest in the people who live in the houses. Not really, not as human beings. You get these people who say, well, what's wrong with a one-bedroom flat? You know, it's this families, the people that I think are least well served are the sort of bottom. There's about 20% of the population will never afford to buy a house, and something's got to be done about that, but that's a different discussion. Mm-hmm. There is then about 20% of the population which have got families and are stuck in very small houses, and the rest of us are fine. We buy space, don't we? What's the first thing you do when you move? You're buying more space, always. So I think that there should be a great deal more focus on that. There's very little research. You look around, there's almost nothing on the topic of how people live today. They have to fit the mold. The mold doesn't fit them, because if the mold fitted them, it would be inconvenient and it would lower land values. Therefore, they don't fit the mold around them. That's why Jackie's trying to fit a bigger mold around them, I think. I think that the other thing I wanted to talk about very quickly is we talked to 4 different housing ministers, 2 Labour, 2 Conservative, all 4 of them among the better of the 19, let's put it that way, okay? And what came out from them is the entire political system of developing and managing housing policy. It's completely dysfunctional and amateur. Both parties, I might say, are to blame. And it works a bit like this. They have a think tank which comes up with ideas, usually produced by children. These ideas then get fed into government. They then get put into manifestos, and they have to be introduced. Now, I'm as much to blame as anybody else. I was involved in a think tank for Gordon Brown in 2004, and our ideas went into government things. And at the time, even then, this is the start of my sort of puzzlement about the whole thing. At the time, there was a woman called Kate Barker. They were going to change the planning system to make life wonderful. Everything would be fine. And we had a meeting at number 11 to talk about what was going to happen. And there was talk about SIL, which the thing that became SIL, which is a boring subject, but it's a tax. And I stood up, I said to her, you can't tax an opinion. But they tried, and they're still trying. Fortunately, and this is where I will give this government, I think I've actually called this a stroke of genius. They are now going to not tax they're going to get rid of all that, and they're going to tax whatever the house is sold for at the end, at some point in time. Won't go into that, but the incompetence, coming back up to the Conservative, affordable homes, complete nightmare. None were ever built. Jackie would tell you the amount of intellectual energy that went into formulating the policy that came from some bloke whose name I've left out of the book in case he sues me.
He means starter homes. Can I just clarify? You mean starter homes, not before all the housing associations in the audience all get up in arms about the fact they haven't built any homes. He doesn't mean affordable homes. He means starter homes.
I do.
Right, as you were, you sad old man. Go on, get on with it.
Non-starter homes. And all he got was a slap on the wrist from the NAO in the end. For whatever it was. So I think that inability, the intellectual inability of government to think through a sustainable long-term housing policy is quite scary, actually. It's quite scary to listen to the people who do it tell you it can't be done properly. That's scary. And I'm not, but I will end on a positive that they have sorted out this infrastructure tax, it's called, which is a good thing. I think that's a great thing. And finally, after a lot of mucking around, there's another bit of the book that's going to be slightly redundant, which is our rage against permitted development rights. They've now going to put space standards on permitted development rights. So they're not all bad. Everything isn't all bad. And but there's a lot more that can be done.
But the electoral cycle mitigates against any proper solution to this problem. And we were very impressed with Gavin Barwell, who was quite short-lived as a housing minister, but we thought made quite a difference when he was obviously then went into number 10 to run Mrs May's. He was Mrs May's chief of staff, but he'd got a very big intellectual grasp of what needed to happen, and he was very keen on getting the word broken into the title of his white paper, that the housing market was broken. We maintain the housing market is broken, but there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is the electoral cycle.
We got a couple of questions coming in from the audience, I'm pleased to say. One of them, we've talked a lot about volume house builders. Brian Horn asks, are local SMEs part of the solution, or even not local SMEs, I imagine? Are we less likely to get cookie cutter homes from SMEs? Do you think increasing the diversity of the house builder delivery market would be a good thing?
I think it's I looked into this because obviously the government's very keen on getting SMEs into this market, and it's completely changed since whenever it was. But the more I looked at it, and I ended up doing a graph on it in the book, because I like graphs, it hasn't made the slightest difference that all the SMEs have gone. If you actually look at the housing numbers, they've gone up pretty well across the top 7 or 8, and the rest of the market, well, they've gone up almost the same. So in other words, there hasn't been this enormous shift to the volume house builders as you might think there would have been. I can see why the government wants to encourage small house builders, but if you look at the numbers, I was looking at judging some journalism awards last week, and there's a very interesting piece from somebody who got the Freedom of Information Act on how much this process of supporting small builders with loans had produced homes. It's hardly any. Half of them disappeared in disgust halfway through the process because it was all too complicated. And those that did, I think from memory, about 14,000 homes are supported by those loans. It's nothing. Yeah, I think it's a good idea, but it's more driven by votes than it is by need.
Yeah, I mean, if I could add, I mean, this is one of the things that Homes England wring their hands about quite a lot, and you know, it's a kind of accepted truth that we need more SMEs in the market, and certainly I would buy into that truth. One of the non-magic bullets, but one of the partial solutions that Peter and I come up with in the book, and it's no surprise really, is the stewarded model. And this is, I don't know, the likes of Urban and Civic, Grosvenor, and now my own company, which is obviously a parvenu in all of this, are bringing forward big sites. And I'm not going to be out carrying the hod on the site myself. You know, we will be parceling that site up. I've got a consent for 1,500 homes, and we'll be putting out parcels. Now, you don't have to just put out a parcel of 200 at a time to a volume house builder. You could put out a lot of smaller parcels. And one of the things I'm very committed to is getting diversity into the system that way. But I can't think of any other way, really, of doing it neatly and cleanly. And certainly when Homes England announced in May, I think it was, that they were going to step up as master developer in their own right and buy sites and start to do that, I hailed that as a big breakthrough, really, for SME builders, and would really like to encourage more and more. But it's a difficult one. It's a really difficult one. These guys, you know, in the main, a big raft of them got wiped out in the noughties and aren't going to be able to come back again in the same sort of way. In exactly the same way as Peter and I, who are naturally inclined towards the council housing model. You know, we're sort of old lefties, really, I suppose. He's a bit more lefty than me, but I'm a lefty with a small L. We quite like the council housing model, and certainly at the end of the 70s, for instance, we were pretty well solving the housing crisis in this country. See what I mean about the curated books? I don't believe that book. That just came in from Amazon, I'm telling you now. Anyway, oh God, here we go. Right, it's now going to show you them all. But we just about solved the housing problem in this country by the end of the 1970s because of the council housing model. We can't go back there. We've had austerity. We do not any longer have a borough engineer, a borough surveyor, a borough architect. There is no capacity in the council, in the local authority system to do this. The local authorities might have land, they might be able to do the same sort of stewarded stuff that UKR is doing, or Urban and Civic is doing, or Homes England is doing, might be doing it in partnership. There is a role for local authorities in here, but they haven't got the skills themselves. So I'm a great one and Brian's absolutely right to ask the question. We need far more SMEs coming into the market, and obviously the SMEs of today could be the big builders of tomorrow, and we want all of that, but it's a tough one to crack unless we start to do this benevolent stewardship type model.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one of the problems that SMEs have, the volume house builders don't, to quite such a great degree, is cash flow. So if you watch small builders at the moment, they have struggled much more with the site suspensions through the pandemic than the larger builders. And you know, that's just a natural thing.
But if we as the master developer do all the interstitial spaces, if we do the roads, we look after the little pocket parks and all the rest of it, and we put out parcels of, say, I mean, I don't know, I'm going to get shouted at by my team now for saying something that isn't viable, but you know, if we could put out parcels of 10 or 15 to an SME builder, God knows I will try and do it. I will try and do it, Ross.
I'm sure you will, but the key thing that you said there, it's not, you know, the size of the parcels matters, but that's a kind of a funding thing. The interstitial spaces and the other stuff that otherwise the small builder has to deliver, that's quite a big deal for them.
Electricity. We've had to go to Homes England for a housing infrastructure fund grant to get juice into Biggleswade. If you were to put another 500 homes into Biggleswade, there'd be no more juice. It's as simple as that. You know, sewage systems, electricity, and of course, you know, internet connections, you know, the whole data connectivity is supreme. You know, all of that has got to be provided up front. Yeah, and it costs a lot of money, right? I mean, utilities are eye-watering. But Peter, just coming back to you, we were talking about government making changes. They've just brought out all these proposed planning reforms. Surely that's going to solve all the problems now.
I think the infrastructure tax, as I said earlier, is a stroke of genius. Nobody agrees with me, but it is. There's 17 pages of the book going through the appalling history of people trying to tax land. And this idea of just taxing the opinion at the end is a brilliant idea. It's not a brilliant idea if you're a council, because it means you don't get the money until the end. But it is a brilliant idea if you're a small house builder, for instance. I don't know what the cutoff will be. Maybe let's say it's 20 houses and nobody has to bother, but it won't be below a certain number. But the impact on your cash flow of not having to pay all this stuff up front and only having to pay for it at the end is quite big. And the impact on your financing costs are quite big. It won't be any less. They promised to keep the tax up. It won't be any less, but you could be, you know, on a big site, you could be shifting 25 million from the front end to the back end. And that could be 6 or 8 years. That's a huge sum of money not to have to pay for 6 or 7 years. So that is a good thing. The rest of it, I think it's all mixed up with this delusion. It's a delusion held by both parties that if you fix the planning system, houses will magically appear. Houses appear when people get when they've got the capital and that want to take the risk to build them. It's nothing to do with the bloody housing about the amount of land available. The only thing that having more land zoned for housing means is the price of land will come down a bit, I suspect. Now, that delusion it's a political delusion, which any politician who thinks about it for 5 minutes will know it's what I call a factoid. It's one of these phrases which is so often made that people think it to be true. And it's, if you're a politician, it's a convenient untruth. If you're a planner, for instance, most planners believe this to be the case as well. And they get quite upset when you say improving the planning system won't provide more houses, because they think it will as well, because it's in their interest to think it will. Well, it doesn't. All you have to do is look at what happens to the economy in line with what happens to house sales. The housing market, the new housing market, is tied to the economy, not to the amount of land available. You just have to look at what happens when there's a slump or a boom. It goes up and down like a roller coaster with the economy, not by the amount of land there is available to build.
Yeah, I know. I've got a slightly different way of expressing it, which is that housing demand is not in terms of units; it's in terms of available amount of cash.
Both on both sides of the equation as well. Actually, you know, on the side of the house builder and on the side of the buyer. But it's a convenient untruth that nobody will admit to being untrue, I'm afraid. And because it makes great headlines. I used to go to the party conferences, and every year somebody would stand up and say, we're going to build 100,000 houses next year. Politicians do not put one brick upon another. Planners do not put one brick upon another. Architects don't put bricks on top of each other. The only people who put bricks on top of each other are house builders and, to some extent, housing associations. But when you look at what they've been saddled with over the last 10 years in terms of debt and now in terms of Grenfell repairs, they're not the answer either. There is a piece in the book that shows how many houses, this 300,000 house idea, it's not going to happen. They're not going to get to 300,000 houses by whenever it is Boris would like it to happen. The only way you can get there is to build for the state to build houses to rent in one form or another. The build to rent market isn't big enough to do it. At that point, I'll bring in Jackie, who's probably listened to me quite enough on both those topics, and see what she's got to say. What do you think?
I'll just throw something in, which is that, again, coming from the audience, from Alice, Lester, from Brent. Brent has a development program of 1,000 new homes being built every year over the next 5 years. And have also bought 500 units from private developers on site or planned for council homes. Is this a way through this mess, do you think?
Well, just quickly to say to Alice from Brent, and hello, Brent, and God knows I miss you guys. I mean, absolutely, this is the way through, and actually, you're showing a beacon of light, really, as to what an enlightened local authority can do. And I obviously know your work terribly well, particularly in South Kilburn, and I know what you can do when you're being empowered and at your best. And I'm thrilled, actually, absolutely thrilled. That you are in the audience, Alice, and that you're still, fighting the good fight, frankly. We could do with an awful lot more like you. But to go back to the planning reforms and the latest planning white paper, I mean, there isn't anybody who's involved in the planning system in the UK who wouldn't say it doesn't need reform. It is absolutely sclerotic, and it is a tick box exercise, which is demoralising. And expensive and wasteful and all the things we know it to be. Sadly, this latest white paper is not the panacea. It's not the reform we all need. It really isn't. And actually, every time we get planning reforms announced, they are the greatest ever planning reforms ever been announced since the, Second World War and all the rest of it. And this one in particular, this latest one, is really not it. It is a repetitious, badly written paper. It's got some dreadful ideas in it. I mean, PDR, Pete's already covered that off. I mean, what a nightmare PDR is, and particularly in failing town centres where you actually need to start really curating the offer rather than just letting residential rip through and spoil whatever you've got there. Absolutely disastrous policy. And then, of course, housing numbers by algorithms. Well, algorithms have got a really good rap this summer, haven't they? I mean, what did they think was going to happen with the backwoods Tories when the algorithms were announced in places like Bedfordshire? And trust me, the Mayor of Biggleswade's on the BBC today railing against algorithms in the planning system. 70 Tory MPs rising up against it. I'm sorry, the algorithms will hit the cutting room floor, and rightly. Pete's point about the tax thing, I mean, he and I, we argue about a lot of things. One of them is that we have a perennial argument about car parking, which we won't bore you with now. But, you know, that he might be absolutely on the money about the tax thing for all I know, in that at the moment, you know, the uneasy, you know, the squeamish compromise between SIL and Section 106 is a mess, you know, and actually that needs reforming as well. But if you're going to reform planning, you know, number one, I was always taught to fix the roof when the sun was shining. Don't do it in the middle of a bloody pandemic, for Christ's sake, when all we want is certainty in the market. You're putting more uncertainty into the market. Why are you doing that? And number two, if you're going to do it again, do it properly, please, Mr. Government, because we can't, I haven't got the time. I'm exhausted. I'm old. I'm grumpy. I haven't got the bandwidth to faff around with these nonsense proposals. Sorry, but there it is.
So you don't think that they're going to solve the problems then?
In a word, no.
Let's just step back to that infrastructure tax, because it is interesting. And you know, Jackie, you and Peter disagree. And Peter, I might be tempted to agree with you. I know that paying your Section 106 SIL up front is a cash flow headache for builders of all sizes, actually. But deferring it until afterwards is nice for them. But how can you then use that to deliver the infrastructure? And I'm not just talking about roads, I'm talking about the social infrastructure that's required to sustain the occupiers that move into the development as it builds out over a range, probably over a number of phases. And I think, you know, front-loading infrastructure has been shown to be important. How can we square that up?
Yeah, I think a couple of points I'd make. One is that the official point is that the councils will have to, or the local planning authorities or whatever they are, will have to borrow the money, okay, to fund it. That's one point. So that's what they'll tell you. I think there's another more subtle point as well. And this might be a bit, you know, cynical to say so, but I think that lots of councils, it's become a game, hasn't it? There's these experts on both sides. There's sort of like armies of people who know how many angels you can get on a brickbat on one side and the other side. And these long arguments. It's costly. They've all got a vested interest in it remaining the same. I would have, and as Jackie will tell you, I mean, I've seen some Section 106 agreements make your bloody hair stand on end. I saw one where you have to pay for the cemetery, because after all, you've got people in your houses who are going to die. Now, that sort of thing, I think, will go away. How can they can't ask for it because there's no mechanism for asking for it.
I see.
They just get told by the central government that it's this percent or that percent on the asking price, and therefore you guys are going to get that money. No, we're not going to let you go and argue with them about another school or another extension to the town hall or whatever it is. All that gets swept away. And I would have thought a lot of this stuff that's been added in over the last 10 or 15 years will just disappear, along with the army of people who've been making lots of money out of advising both sides of the case. I think that's why I think it's a bit of a genius idea. It's going to get rid of a huge amount of faff.
That's an interesting angle you just flagged up, which is I've often wondered how much money goes into the process of house building that doesn't actually contrip to the output.
You can have a look at the have a look at the appraisals in the book.
Yeah.
And they're not real appraisals, but they show you how much money in these two cases goes on things that aren't the houses themselves, and it's tens of millions.
It's terrifying. It's terrifying. But Peter's right in essence. I mean, you know, we do quibble about how to tax, you know, and he might be right about the infrastructure tax, but I'll tell you this, Section 106 probably isn't it. I mean, I like it because I understand it, but it's a bit like an ancient doctor saying, well, you know, why can't you junior medics do 80 hours a week on the wards? I did 80 hours a week on the wards. It's not an enlightened position. Just because I've got my head around 106 that I'm trying to support 106. I have to say to you, there's a shed load of housing estates that have been built in the last 10 years with a great welter of undischarged Section 106 obligations that should have gone into community provision that just have not been enforced, have not been policed, have not been regulated, and have just allowed people to get off scot-free without providing for their communities. So Peter might be right about the infrastructure tax. He might well be. The problem I've got with it is it's buried deep in a document which I think, frankly, doesn't really stand a cat's chance in hell.
Could I just make one last point on that white paper, which I think is worth remembering for those in the audience? It's a question I asked Stuart Lipton, who was involved in the framing of this new tax, of this new white paper, and it provides a glimmer of hope for those of us who would like space standards. Now, I don't know whether this is going to come off, but when pressed, Sir Stuart, when pressed very hard, said to me that local authorities will be able to set their own space standards. Now, I haven't seen it anywhere else. It's in the piece I wrote for Property Week a couple of weeks ago. So I said to him, do you mean that they can stay, instead of the houses being 12 feet wide, they can be 22 feet wide like they were in 1909? And he said, yes. So if there's anybody out there on the local authority side, they might just keep their eye open for this one. I think I suspect it will get squashed somewhere, but there is a chance for local authorities, I think, to set their own space standards at the moment.
The cynic in me can't help but observe that a local authority that wanted to discourage new homes in its area would simply set the space standards at
it might want to. You might get an enlightened one that wants to either A, encourage better homes in its area, or B, discourage matchbox homes in its area. So who knows? Who knows?
I would hope that we would. Let's say I'd hope that we would. Jackie, I've got to ask you. Peter mentioned your magic wand. Where do you want to wave it?
Well, he sets me up a bit with the magic wand thing, you know, because actually we don't have all the answers. We would like to waive it over planning reform, but proper planning reform, as the sort we just discussed. I mean, frankly, I'm still a fan of the NPPF. I think if we implemented the NPPF as was in 2011, we'd be in a much better place. It's a very good policy that isn't implemented, you know. So why are we trying to reinvent the wheel? But let's not go back to planning policy. I think the magic wand that we were trying to wave, I mean, you know, it's a tricky one, isn't it? You know, land is a scarce commodity. We're not manufacturing anymore. So what do? Well, you do a cleverer use of land, really, and that goes back to the stewarded model. And I'm really heartened by Alice from Brent sitting in the audience, not just because I love Brent and I love Alice and I love what they're trying to do, but I think the custodian of place model, and this is a real struggle for us because this bucks the system as it's currently. What we're seeing at the moment in government is more and more centralisation. You know, these algorithms were a centralisation policy, and actually we'd like to see, and I think this is where Peter and I genuinely do agree, we agree on most things, I hasten to say, is far more localism, far more pushed out to the custodians of place. We start from the position that the experts in any community are the people who live there. And, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, you know, who else would you have really decide, you know, how to, I mean, you encourage capacity for green, clean, inclusive growth wherever you can through a stewarded model and behaving properly. But we don't have, Peter's written this up very beautifully and has me cast as Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz. We sadly do not have a magic wand, but we do believe there is no place like home.
Well, Dorothy didn't have a magic wand either. She
had shoes though.
Yes, and
girls can't have enough shoes.
So
yes,
you have
yes.
Shoes. Yes, I don't know. I'm not sure it's shiny red ones, but anyway.
He was a good fairy, not Dorothy.
A good fairy. We're coming towards the end of our time, believe it or not. It's flown by. Peter, do you want to say anything in conclusion, just to kind of anything you might not have said or anything that you want to re-emphasize?
Just a little bit about the stewardship thing, which sounds really boring. There is a model sort of emerging where people like Urban and Civic and things, and Jackie's company and others are getting involved. It seems to be a decent enough way forward. So that's a slightly boring thing I'd like to say. There's slightly more. The thing we didn't talk about was prefabrication and modern methods of construction, and I'm a bit frightened of it, to be honest. I know it's coming. Jackie's probably going to be using it, but I'm slightly worried by the thoughts today from the minister saying they won't give out grant. They're going to make sure that the Homes England has to do 25% MMC on its new homes. I think the government should really not get that involved, frankly. This is a Conservative government. They're not. It's not sort of. It's not Labour. Well, why would Labour do it? But it's not. It just frightens me that in 10 years' time, the inquiry into Method X, which has made things fall down, will go back to Mr. Jenrick saying, well, he told us to do it. So I'm slightly worried about this prefabrication drive, and I'm slightly worried about people who view it as an answer to the housing crisis. It's an answer to technical issues, and it will give better houses, but I don't think it will. It doesn't mean the house will be any cheaper. It means they might be cheaper to build, which goes to the builder. They won't be any cheaper for the people living in them. And so I'm just slightly, I have to worry about something, and that's it, really. I'm just worried about people going into it too much. And as ever, it will be the poorest houses in the poorest areas, built at the cheapest prices, where something will go wrong.
I'd kind of agree. I think it's a constraint that need not be imposed.
Just odd. Why
restrain the market at a time when the market needs to be freed, I think.
Yeah.
So.
And you just have to you just look at the Grenfell inquiry and what's going on there, and you think, could you trust this industry?
With all my heart.
That's it from me. I'll stop preaching now. And thank you very much for having me, everybody. This is my Zoom Virgin meeting, and it's been interesting to say the least. So
we'd never have known.
No.
So, Jack, is there anything you want to throw in just as a final?
Well, other than to say, you must never waste a good crisis, and we've got to learn from this pandemic. And if there's one thing we're going to learn, and things are going to be very, very different, it is that, the home is going to become more and more and more important, and that everyone deserves better. I'm pushing the 15-minute community very, very hard. But I have to say I'm more exercised about the delivery of infrastructure and about getting people out of their cars than I am about anything else, really, if the truth be known. And we're not great at it in this country. And I'm quite encouraged, actually, by some of the things that Mr. Shapps has been saying recently, funny enough. And I'm kind of hoping that that's going to be sorted out. However, my hopes were given a bit of a dash today when I learned that HS2 is not going up the eastern leg to Leeds. I think that's a real retrograde step, and I think it's a big mistake. But anyway, life isn't easy at the moment. I just will hang on to the two tenets, I suppose, is that, we've got to learn from the pandemic, and that everybody deserves better. And I mean everybody. It isn't just the customers, the people who move into the homes. It's the supply chain, it's the workforce, it's the people who already live next to these places. Everyone deserves better, everyone. Excellent.
And I think that is an absolutely perfect place to end, which is lucky because it's 5 o'clock and it's time to end. Thanks both of you. It's been fabulous fun talking to you both. I hope the audience has enjoyed it too. I have posted in the chat a link to where you can buy Peter and Jackie's book. Be a fantastic read. Might take you a few days to get through, but take the plunge. Available, published in October, it says, I believe next week, by Troubadour. Only 20 quid. How can you resist? I think, Amy, if we can just pop the poll result up, we'll just let people know how they voted. I'm going to bet that it's delivery of housing. Wow. Okay, so that's number one again, and that's twice in my sessions today that the audience has produced the right result for the speaker panel. So that's absolutely fabulous. Thank you everybody for that. Thank you also for joining this. It's been, as I said, it's been really enjoyable. If you want to see more Real Estate Live, feel free. This is the last one for today, but we've got some great stuff tomorrow. We kick off with Belfast at 9, which I'm really looking forward to. You can see me again on that, I'm afraid, but I'll try not to talk too much. And there's plenty of innovation going on. There's an innovation district section and a placemaking for innovation section. So if you're interested in providing stuff for companies focused on innovation, get yourselves onto those two. Thanks very much. As I said, Jackie, Peter, brilliant. Delegates, fabulous. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your evening. Good night.